The jungle on Vera 9 was not like anything found on Earth. Its colors were too rich, its sounds too strange. The air itself seemed to move with a purpose, like it watched every step and held its breath in silence. Beneath thick vines and giant leaves that curled inward as if hiding secrets too old to speak aloud, the human expedition team moved slowly deeper into the dense wilderness, with their eyes wide and their voices quiet. Reed walked ahead, his boots pressing into the sponge-like surface of the jungle floor, his eyes scanning the strange terrain while his handheld device blinked with weak signals. He was not a scientist like the others. He had come on this mission as a mechanic and engineer, someone who fixed broken things. But when the jungle started to shift around them, he felt the weight of something else entirely, something alive and not friendly. Clara followed behind with her small recorder always running. Her hands moved over the alien plants, carefully collecting samples, noting details, her voice calm even when the leaves moved without wind. She had studied hundreds of flora across dozens of planets, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever looked so alive in a way that sent cold across the back of her neck every time she turned away from a flower, only to find it facing her again. The others in the team kept close, their steps unsure, their words short. The jungle seemed to swallow sound and motion, both as if it drank their presence like water. Each moment stretched longer than the one before, and the air became heavier with every breath they took. It started when the signal flared again, a sharp pulse from the lost research pod that had gone silent months ago, buried deep within this green living maze. Clara's scanner caught the burst, and she moved fast, breaking away from the team before anyone could stop her. Her curiosity stronger than her caution. Reed shouted after her, but she was already gone between thick roots and hanging tendrils that closed behind her like soft jaws. Her voice was still on the coms, calm and focused, describing what she saw as she moved closer to the source. She talked about massive petals bright as fire and long transparent sacs hanging like fruit from a twisted tree. She said she thought she saw remains inside, something like bones, maybe gear, maybe what was left of the old crew. Then her voice cut off. Reed did not think he ran, he just moved, pushed through the jungle with fists and fire in his chest. He followed the broken trail she had left, crushed leaves, snapped vines, and a few dropped items. Her voice never returned, and neither did her signal. He reached a clearing, unlike any space they had passed through before. It was open, round, and quiet. Too quiet. In the center of it stood a giant plant taller than two men, wide like a dome. Its outer skin shone with soft light, and inside one of its hanging sacs something moved slowly, helplessly suspended. Reed stepped closer, his breath stuck in his throat inside the translucent skin. He saw Clara, her body, curled arms, floating eyes half closed, her suit already torn in places. The fluid around her thick and green, bubbling gently as if tasting her. Her fingers twitched, once reaching toward him, even though she could not see. The plant moved when he did, its long tendrils slipping along the ground toward him like snakes. It did not rush, it did not strike. It simply reached, knowing he would either run or try to fight, and either way it would learn from him. Reed backed away only enough to think, his mind racing. His cum crackled with the voices of the others, asking where he was, if he had found her, if she was alive. But he said nothing yet. His eyes stayed locked on the terrible beauty in front of him, a plant that could not just trap, but digest a person slowly, piece by piece, while they floated inside, watching everything fade. The others arrived soon after they saw what he saw, and fear passed through them like lightning. Some shouted for retreat, others begged him to come back, but Reed only stepped forward again. His hands clenched and jaw tight. His tools were limited. His suit was not built for combat, and the plant was not just a plant, it was a trap, a predator. Patient and perfect. They tried to stop him, told him it was too late, that she was already gone, or would be soon, that the risk was too high and they could not lose another. But he looked back at Clara's face, just visible through the membrane, her mouth slightly open, her eyes barely moving, and he knew she was not gone, not yet. Promised once that he would never leave anyone behind again, not after what happened on That frozen station not after the last time he ran out of time and breath. And heard someone scream as the doors closed. Now he had a chance to fight, a chance to pull someone back from the edge, and he would not waste. Reed took his cutting tool from his side, adjusted the power, focused the beam, and tested it against a thick vine. It hissed and smoked, but the plant recoiled slowly, curious rather than afraid. And that told him it could be hurt, that it could bleed if he found the right place. And that told him it could be hurt, that it could be hurt, that it could bleed. It could be hurt, that it could bleed, if he found the right place. Moved in closer each step, slow, his eyes watching every motion of the tendrils that coiled and slid across the ground. They did not strike yet, they only waited and watched. The plant wanted to understand him, the same way he was trying to understand it. The others backed away, pulling their gear, gathering their strength to retreat, while he remained standing at the edge of the living trap alone, with the sound of Clara's weak breaths echoing in his mind. Knew what came next would either save her or take them both, but he also knew he would not walk away without trying, because if there was one thing this jungle had not seen before, it was the fire of a human who refused to let go, refused to surrender, and refused to accept that this was the end. Aimed his cutter again and took one more step forward. Stood in front of the massive plant, while the others disappeared behind the wall of vines that slowly returned to cover the path. No one spoke now, and even the Cums had fallen silent. The team had left, but not out of fear. They left because Reed told them to. He made them promise to return to the shuttle and wait for his signal, though they all knew there might be none, and that silence might be the last message he ever sent. He turned his eyes back toward the living dome of green flesh and pale sacks that hung like strange fruit from thick branches. The plant had not attacked. Not yet. It had simply captured, observed, and waited. Its tendrils still moved across the soft ground, but now they drifted more slowly, as if the plant had grown bored, or perhaps it was thinking. Reed did not know if the thing had a mind or instinct, but he could feel it watching him, not just seeing but understanding in a way that made his skin crawl. Clara's body still floated inside the fluid, her limbs limp, her chest rising with effort, her face pale, and still her oxygen was low and her vitals weak. The plant had begun the process of feeding, draining her slowly without breaking her. It was not killing her out of hunger, it was testing her, and Reed knew time was slipping away like sand through broken fingers. Checked the power levels on his cutter and adjusted the setting, pushing more energy into the core. The beam was small but focused enough to burn through metal. It might work on the outer skin of the plant if he struck at the right point. He had no backup, no med team, and no plan beyond raw force and whatever instinct still lived in his bones from battles long past. Reed stepped forward again, moving around the base of the plant. Searching for a weakness, he found thick roots half buried in the jungle floor. They pulsed with a slow rhythm like the beat of a hidden heart. He pressed the cutter against one root and activated the beam. A sharp hiss followed, then smoke, and the smell of burning flesh. Not animal, not wood, but something in between. Plant reacted at once. Its tendrils snapped up like whips and curled toward him, but they stopped inches from his body, as if confused. The burned root twitched, then curled back into the soil, and the ground beneath him shifted slightly, not enough to knock him down, but enough to remind him that the jungle was not stable, and nothing here was dead. Stepped back and checked his cutter again. The battery was holding, but not for long. He would need to get inside and get her out fast, or the plant would adapt and close off every path he could take. He remembered what Clara once said about alien flora that learned from contact, that shifted shape and purpose depending on the threat. Now he was that threat, and the plant was learning fast. He reached into his bag and pulled out the emergency flare he had rigged earlier. It was not much, just a heat core wrapped in metal casing, filled with short-range shock pulses. Used for clearing cave-ins or thick brush, it might work as a way to distract the plant or burn through a second layer if he got trapped inside. He held it in his left hand and the cutter in his right, then looked one last time at Clara. He whispered her name even though she could not hear him. He remembered her laugh during the long flight to Vera 9. Her quiet focus when studying samples, her stubborn refusal to rest, even when the team stopped to eat, he remembered. How she once told him that life should be preserved at all costs, no matter the risk, no matter the cost. And now he was here standing. Between her and the thing trying to pull her apart cell by cell, Reed moved forward with steady steps. Reaching the base of the central sac, the one holding her body, he placed the cutter against the skin and started the beam again. This time he did not stop even when the tendrils shot toward him again this time. They struck with force, slamming against his suit, throwing sparks and pushing him back. But he braced himself and kept cutting. The fluid inside began to bubble more fiercely, and Clara's body turned slightly as if reacting to the pain. The plant screeched, but not with sound. It screamed through motion, through pressure, through vibration that moved through the ground and air. And Skin Reed felt it like a wave crashing into his bones. But he did not fall. He pressed harder, pushed deeper. The membrane began to split, and a greenish mist poured out, carrying the thick smell of acid and decay. The plant twisted around itself, its branches curling, its sacs shaking, but it could not move. Fast enough, Reed reached in with both arms and pulled Clara free. Her body was slick and heavy, but still breathing, still warm. He slung her across his shoulder and turned just as the sack collapsed behind him, spilling fluid across the ground that hissed and steamed where it touched his boots. The tendril struck again. One wrapped around his leg and tried to pull him back, but he slammed the flare into it and triggered the shock. A burst of blue light followed, and the tendril recoiled, writhing. Like a cut snake, he did not stop. He ran with Clara's weight across his back, his breath loud in the silence, his mind locked on one thing: escape. The jungle seemed to close around him again. Vines fell from the trees, roots rose from the ground. But he moved with pure force, kicking, burning, shoving the green away, until finally he broke through to the edge, where the mist cleared, and the light from his beacon flashed in the distance. The signal for the others, the mark he had promised to send. He stumbled to the ground just beyond the wall of vines. Clara's body still held tight in his arms. The med team rushed forward, pulled her from him, checked her vitals, started treatment. But Reed did not hear them. He only stared back at the place. He had come from the place that had nearly eaten them both. He had gone in with tools and fire, but what saved her was not metal or power. It was something the plant had not expected. It was the one thing it could not learn to fight: human will inside. The medpod. Clara lay still, her chest rose and fell slowly, her skin pale and slick with the last trace of the plant's acid. Her breathing was thin and her pulse weak, but she was alive even with her suit torn and body soaked in foreign fluid. Machines kept her stable for now, but time was not her friend, and neither was the alien jungle that still waited outside. Like a beast unfinished with its prey, Reed stood beside her with a silent fire behind his eyes. His clothes were stained with burns and cuts, his hands rough from gripping sharp roots and pushing against crushing vines. But he did not rest, not yet. The medic told him she needed a cure, something to clean the residue in her lungs, something not stored in the shuttle because it had never been needed before, and that something might only exist back inside the plant. The others argued against going back. They said he had done enough, that she was already saved, but Reed knew the truth. He had only stolen her back from the edge. The plant had not given up. It had only let go for a moment, and in that moment, Reed had dragged her out through pain and fire. But the fight was not over, not while Clara still struggled to breathe, not while the jungle still reached for her. Through the air and her blood, he packed what he needed: a breathing mask, a fresh cutter, a sample case, and the scanner that Clara had used earlier, which still blinked with strange data from the core of the plant. He checked the readings once more, then stepped out of the shuttle into the wet green air, where the jungle moved like a sleeping animal, half awake and always listening. Path he had taken before was gone, covered again by vines and twisted roots, but he moved through without hesitation. Guided by memory and instinct, each step forward pressed against resistance, like walking into deep water, thick with unseen danger. His breath was steady, his focus sharp. Nothing else mattered, not fear, not pain, not the weight of failure that waited. If he came back empty-handed, the closer he came to the center, the warmer the air became, and the softer the ground felt beneath his boots. Small plants opened as he passed, releasing clouds of pollen that shimmered like dust in the light his suit kept most of it out, but the scent still reached him, sharp and bitter like burnt sugar and something darker, something rotten beneath sweetness. He arrived at the clearing again. The massive plant had grown its roots deeper, its branches higher. The sacs were still there, though not full, not yet. They swayed gently with a rhythm like slow breathing, and the tendrils, once hidden, now moved openly across the ground like long fingers ready to close at the first sign of weakness. Reed did not pause. He walked straight into the field, holding his scanner forward. The plant reacted at once. Its center pulsed, and the branches curved inward, but not to attack. It made room. A narrow path opened beneath the hanging sacs, leading into the thickest part of the growth, and Reed understood this was not an invitation. It was a test, a challenge. The plant remembered him, and it wanted to learn more. He stepped inside the tunnel of green, where the air grew thick and warm, where light barely touched, and the walls pulsed with slow color like veins filled with glowing liquid. Every surface was alive, not just with motion, but with thought. He could feel it around him, pressing into his skin, through his boots and gloves, through his breath, even through his thoughts, as if the plant was trying to read him, trying to understand the shape of what made him human. The scanner beeped with strange symbols, readings that changed too fast to follow, energy patterns that bent like spirals, signals like whispers. From deep water, he followed the signals downward into the heart of the structure, where the walls narrowed and the temperature rose. Clara had been trapped near the surface, but this was something deeper, something older, a place not meant for eyes or minds. In the center of that space, he found it, a pod larger than the others, pulsing softly, with thick vines wrapped around it like ribs. Inside was no body, no bones, only liquid and strange glowing roots that reached upward into the ceiling. The scanner lit up red, marking it as the source, the core, the part that controlled the rest. This was the mind, the center of the plant, where thought and action began. Reed reached into his bag and pulled out the sample case. He took a small cutting tool and carefully sliced one of the roots. The liquid hissed, but the pod did not move. It only pulsed faster. The walls around him tightened slightly, and a soft hum filled the air. Not noise, not voice, but something like a question, not spoken with words, but with feeling. "Why are you here?" Reed did not answer with sound. He pressed his hand to the wall and focused his thoughts. He showed the image of Clara fighting to breathe, the memory of pulling her out, the burn of her suit melting under acid, the sound of her voice before it vanished. He showed the feeling of carrying her through the vines, the weight of her life in his arms, and the silence of the others watching him break rules just to save one person. The hum changed, shifted, slowed. The walls relaxed slightly, and the root in his hand loosened its curl. He took it gently, sealed it in the case, and turned to leave. The tunnel closed behind him, but not in anger, not in warning. It closed like a heartbeat, steady and slow and alive. As he stepped back into the clearing, the tendrils did not strike. They moved aside and let him pass. And as he walked away from the heart of the plant, he realized something. It had not tried to kill Clara, not just to eat, not only to trap. It had studied her, it had tested her, and now it was watching him too. Maybe it had never seen anything like them before. Maybe it had never felt what it now called human. Reed returned to the shuttle, carrying the sealed root sample with hands that trembled. Not from fear, but from what he had felt inside the heart of that creature. The jungle had not attacked him. It had not tried to consume him again. Instead, it had opened to him. It had moved in rhythm with his presence, as if it understood his intention, and allowed him to leave, not because he was strong, not because he was fast, but because it had seen something else in him, something that even he did not fully understand. Inside the medbay, Clara was still alive, her chest still rising and falling. With shallow effort, her vitals steady but low, her body weak, but fighting. The medic took the sample and began working fast, breaking down the outer root to extract the inner fluid, while Reed stood silently beside the bed, watching her face, her skin was no longer pale. Her fingers moved slightly, her breath stronger than before, but still far from safe. He watched the mixture being filtered and prepared. The medic worked with care, every step watched closely. Every result tested. The fluid reacted quickly, bonding with the remaining acid inside Clara's lungs, neutralizing it without resistance, as if it recognized her and no longer wanted to fight her presence, as if some part of the plant remembered her form and had decided to stop breaking it. Down hours passed before she opened her eyes slowly, and without sound her gaze drifted across the ceiling, then shifted to the side where Reed sat on a crate. His eyes closed and his arms crossed, his suit still torn and stained with green burn marks. When she tried to speak, no sound came, only a breath barely louder than a whisper, but he heard it anyway and turned toward her with the smallest nod, emotion that held more weight than 1,000 words. She blinked once and then again, her thoughts still slow, her memory returning in pieces. Her voice came back after a few more breaths, and though it was weak, it still held the same steady tone she had always carried. She asked if the others were safe, if the mission was complete, and if the sample had survived. She asked everything except what had happened to her, because some part of her already knew. Reed told her what she needed to hear, not everything, but enough. The jungle was alive in ways they never guessed, and the plant had a center, a mind, a method of learning, and watching it had taken her to see what she was made of. And when it had seen him fight for her, it had learned something new from them both. She listened without emotion, her eyes fixed on his face, and then turned toward the window where the jungle waited. Just beyond the clearing, still moving, still breathing. She asked him one more thing, if he would go back with her, not now, not soon, but someday when they were both ready, because she believed there was something more in that place, something old and deep, and not only dangerous but also intelligent, a mind that did not speak in words but in signals and movement, in patterns, and she wanted to understand it, not just escape it. Reed did not answer right away. He stood and moved toward the control panel where the data from her scanner still glowed across the screen, patterns pulsing in slow motion, repeating loops and shifting spikes that made no sense, yet held meaning in their rhythm. He watched them for a long time before turning back to her and saying yes, not because he wanted to return, but because he knew she would go with or without him, and he would never let her walk into that place alone again. Others were less sure. Some said they should leave the planet as soon as possible, that the jungle was too dangerous, too strange, too alive. But Clara argued with quiet strength, explaining what they had seen, what the plant had done, and what it had not done. She explained that it had the power to kill them all, yet it chose not to. That it reacted with thought and reason, not just hunger and instincts. Some agreed and others did not, but none could deny what Reed had done or what Clara had survived. They decided to stay longer, to build a small lab near the edge of the clearing, to collect more samples and watch the jungle from a safe distance. They set up cameras and sensors. They recorded sound and vibration. They waited and listened, and slowly began to see the patterns for themselves. Reed spent his time repairing broken equipment and watching the trees with quiet eyes. He spoke little, but when he did, it was only to Clara, and always with calm, steady words that said more than others ever could. She walked slowly, at first her strength returning day by day, until she could move without help and stand beside him as they watched the jungle shift with the passing hours. One night the vines moved again, not in attack, not in fear, but in response to music. Clara had played a simple melody from earth, soft and steady, and the tendrils swayed in rhythm, not random, not wild, but measured and clear, like something trying to follow the sound, trying to understand the shape of what it felt. Reed saw it too, the beginning of something, not just survival, not just danger, but contact between species, between minds that had never met before and might never again. He knew they were not safe, not fully, not yet, but they were no longer just intruders. They were guests, now perhaps even students of something older than memory and deeper than fear. Clara stood beside him, her voice stronger, now her eyes bright, as she whispered that this was only the start, that they had touched something ancient and unfinished, And it was waiting for them to return, not as prey, not as enemies, but as something else. Reed did not smile, but he nodded once, and looked back toward the jungle where the leaves moved without wind and the roots pressed upward, as if reaching for light. War was never between man and plant, it was between silence and understanding, between fear and choice, and Reed had made his choice the moment he stepped into the belly of the beast, and refused to come out without her. Sun above Vera 9 rose without warning, pouring gold across the jungle that still moved with quiet hunger and silent memory. The trees shimmered with dew and the leaves curled inward as if to protect some great thought hidden beneath their skin. Clara stood at the edge of the research post, her fingers resting on the rough metal railing, her eyes fixed on the green horizon where the plant still lived, still breathed, still remembered. She had begun walking without support days ago, each step stronger than the last, her voice no longer weak, her hands steady again. But something inside her had changed, not just in body but in mind. Her dreams were filled with images of pulsing light, long vines reaching through silence, patterns that spoke without language, and thoughts that did not belong to her, yet felt strangely close. Reed worked beside the Land Rover, tightening cables, adjusting sensors, sealing cracks left by the last storm, his movements quiet and smooth, his expression calm but focused. He rarely looked up, but always listened, always noticed her presence. Even without turning his head when she approached, he passed her a repaired circuit board without speaking, and she nodded in return. Their communication no longer needed explanation. Not after what they had been through. The rest of the team had started packing equipment into containers, preparing for the next phase of study. They had agreed to leave the deeper parts of the jungle alone, for now, observing only from a distance, watching how the vines grew, how the sacs formed, how the plant reacted to changes in light, heat, and sound. Every day brought new patterns, new signals. Sometimes quiet, sometimes sharp, but always alive. One evening, Clara sat near the outer lights, holding the scanner against her lap, her fingers moving slowly across the display as she read the latest data. The pattern was changing again, the pulse growing faster, the rhythm tighter. It no longer felt random. It felt like a call, not a threat, not a lure, but a signal, like a question, repeated again and again, waiting for an answer. She whispered this to Reed, and he sat beside her without speaking. For a long time, his eyes fixed on the screen that blinked like a heartbeat. He asked her what the plant wanted, and she answered without hesitation. It wanted to understand. Not just her, not just him, but all of them. The sounds they made, the thoughts they carried, the reason why one human would walk into death, for another why a species would fight, not just to survive but to protect something fragile, something soft, something that seemed to hold no logic but burned brighter than fire. That was the one thing the plant could not understand, and yet it had not killed them. It had watched, it had tested, and when it saw what Reed had done, when it felt the force of his will, it had stopped, not out of weakness but curiosity. They decided together to send one last signal, not a message of words, but of emotion. Clara recorded a simple sequence of sounds, her voice singing a low, soft melody, one she had remembered from childhood, something her mother used to hum while planting flowers in their home garden on Earth, a sound filled with memory, with care, with roots older than war or fear. They played the melody through the jungle speakers and waited. The vines did not move at first, the sacs did not shift, but the ground changed. It vibrated gently, like breath held just below the surface. Then the light inside the central plant began to pulse slowly in rhythm, with the song not copying but answering in its own way, with soft flashes, with rising waves of color that matched the notes with perfect care. The others gathered around, watching with silent awe, some of them recording the moment, others simply standing still, letting the feeling settle across their skin. This was not a victory, not a discovery, not even peace, but something more fragile and powerful. It was the moment when something alien chose to respond, when a wall between minds thinned and light passed through. Reed turned to Clara and said nothing. She looked at him and smiled, not with joy or relief but with quiet Strength with the weight of everything they had lived and carried and lost between them. There was now a bond made not of blood or words, but of choices of the moment, when one human decided not to let go, when one spark refused to die. Later, as the shuttle lifted above the jungle, leaving the ground behind and carrying the team toward the orbiting station, Clara looked out the window and saw the green canopy stretch into the distance, still shifting, still alive. She knew they would return, not for battle, not for conquest, but for something deeper. They would return because the story was not over, and because understanding had begun. Reed sat beside her, his arms crossed, his eyes half closed, and though he looked as calm as ever, she knew he was not at rest. He was thinking, always thinking, planning, remembering. He had scars now, deep ones, across his back and arms, and one near his side where the acid had touched skin through a tear in his suit. But those were not the scars that mattered. Real scars were the ones left inside, the ones from past missions, failed rescues, voices he could not forget, doors he could not open in time. Clara had become more than a teammate, more than a scientist. She had become the reason he fought again, the reason he walked back into the dark, and the reason he came out with fire still burning. No one would ever understand what it meant unless they had stood where he stood, unless they had carried someone through vines that screamed and roots that bled, unless they had faced something with no eyes and no voice, and still found a way to speak. The mission was written in reports, the data was sent to command, the samples were sealed and stored. But the real story would never be told in files. It lived in the quiet look between two people who had seen something more than fear, more than science. They had seen the edge of death and returned, with proof that something even more powerful existed inside the human soul. Not machines, not weapons, not numbers, but will pure, stubborn, burning human. Will the end